The heart of Russia, Moscow, was plunged into darkness overnight. The deafening roars piercing the sky sent shivers down the spines of civilians. Exactly 93 unmanned aerial vehicles breached the air defense system that the Kremlin had declared untouchable for years. 354 flights were cancelled, leaving thousands of passengers stranded at airports. In this video, we will not only examine the aftermath of this attack, but also delve into how Russia's aviation system collapsed, how air superiority shifted in favor of Ukraine over Moscow's skies, and the global implications of this event for civil aviation. Sit back, because this is not just a drone attack, it is the collapse of Russia's myth of invincibility in the skies. Moscow's airspace had been touted as a closed circuit for years. With S-400 batteries, Pantsir turrets, and massive radar domes, it was said that objects smaller than a few centimeters in diameter couldn't even get close to Russia's capital. But on July 19th, the city's sky awoke to a completely different scene. Days passed, but the scene remained unchanged. 93 unmanned aerial vehicles, each carrying several hundred grams of explosives in their tiny carbon fiber bodies, entered the capital's surroundings simultaneously, targeting runway lights, radar towers, and communication panels on the roofs of data centers. On that shocking night, a total of 354 scheduled flights were cancelled, and over 200 flights were diverted to emergency routes. Sheremetyevo, Vnukovo, and Domodedovo airports were placed under quarantine. Passengers waiting in the domestic terminal first heard the quarantine announcement, then saw staff rushing around in panic. The scene at all three airports was the same. Passport counters closed. People waiting for receipts at duty-free counters began wrapping their luggage and searching for seats. Within an hour, thousands of families loaded their backpacks onto luggage carts and sat on the carpet. Even the foldable beds distributed urgently in some areas were insufficient. The helplessness and anger of families trying to protect their children as they queued outside the restrooms were evident in their eyes. Children were given military-style camouflage blankets. These were normally kept in military emergency warehouses. In other words, a civilian infrastructure disaster scenario was being implemented for the first time. But the story is not just about people lying on the ground at airports. This was the moment that declared the most dangerous face of modern warfare. The civilian airspace, the daily lives of ordinary people, had now become a battlefield. The fact that one of the world's most heavily defended capitals, like Moscow, could be silenced so easily by drones was a complete fiasco. That night, a wave of unmanned aerial vehicles first passed over radar stations in the Tula region. They then crossed the skies of Kaluga and headed southeast toward Moscow. Drones coming from the west slightly shifted their course northward as the city lights of the capital appeared on the horizon, approaching communication cabins around Sheremetyevo. The eastern flank simultaneously circled around Vladimir and reached the southern antenna field of the Domodedovo runways. The southwestern wing carried an electronic jamming capsule originating from Tula, opened its orbit in the air, and flooded the data communication centers with ghost signals. Each of these routes was within the Russian integrated air defense layer. This means that there was either a blind spot in the radar communications chain or a shortage of personnel. The shortage of specialists is growing every month. Hundreds of thousands of young educated people have left the country out of fear of mobilization. The number of graduates from air defense schools has fallen, and the number of officers on field duty has decreased. This information is not mentioned in government statements, but becomes evident on the ground. When manual intervention is required against a drone swarm, an operator clicking on a target box on the screen could miss the drone instead of the aircraft due to a few seconds of delay. The reports from that night included the phrase, "tower communication saturation." This indicates that the system was operating beyond its capacity. For these reasons, pilots were unable to communicate with the tower. Radar systems were temporarily disabled, and a fire hazard developed on the runway. Here, we see that synchronization is prioritized over speed. These vehicles approach their targets at 100 kilometers per hour, not 500 kilometers per hour. However, when they all touch different points at the same second, the defense network suddenly becomes vulnerable. Thoughtful, what was the cause of this vulnerability in the defense network? Why were the much-praised Russian air defense systems insufficient? The S-400 Triumph air defense system was originally designed to target large radar signal-intensive targets. Its purpose was to act as a zone shield, capable of detecting and striking large objects such as ballistic missiles and fighter jets from 400 kilometers away. The radars used by the system operate on wide wavelengths and are primarily calibrated to detect metal surfaces the size of square meters. However, the problem is that today's carbon fiber-bodied, 20 to 25 centimeters diameter small unmanned aerial vehicles are virtually invisible to these radars. This is because such drones typically appear on radar screens as small signals resembling atmospheric interference. The S-400 theoretically has the capability to track these small targets more closely, but then larger threats, like cruise missiles, approaching from a distance could go unnoticed. In short, because the system is calibrated according to the catch the big target first logic, small UAVs arriving in swarms can bypass this filtering and reach the heart of Moscow. Pantsir S-1 was designed to catch low-altitude targets that the S-400 misses. But there are two major problems. The tracking system relies on human eyesight. It is difficult to spot small drone silhouettes at night. When 7-8 targets arrive at the same time, the operator cannot keep up. The radar has a narrow angle. It sees clearly at close range because it operates in the X-band, but it is slow when scanning drone swarms spread over a wide area. When the radar turns in one direction, the other sides are left exposed. Moreover, the Pantsir lacks advanced swarm tracking software. The automatic target classification capability found in Ukraine's TB2s is not yet available in Russian systems. This leaves the Pantsir vulnerable to swarm attacks. The issue of defensive shifts also stems from this. Since 2022, the air defense ring around Moscow has been redeployed twice. As the threat of Ukrainian-made glide bombs grew, the Kremlin withdrew some of the batteries to the Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk front lines. This reduced the density around the capital. The circular corridor of defense became weaker. The batteries that were moved were replaced by old S-300V combined divisions that had supposedly undergone repairs. But the semiconductor components of these systems are not compatible with modern mini-drone targeting logic. Moscow's defense was a fortress built on the logic of large targets, high radar signatures, and long ranges. The swarm of UAVs, like ants gnawing at a lion, blinded the radar. The Pantsir guns could not distinguish targets, hesitated to fire their expensive missiles, and the few missiles they did fire nullified the cumulative cost advantage in favor of the attacker. This picture painted in the capital's sky exposed the software and algorithm deficiencies of Russian defense architecture when faced with low-cost, high-volume targets. Air defense gaps are turning this into an economic, logistical, and social disaster rather than a technical debate. The social and psychological aspect of the situation was quite distressing. After all, in such extraordinary situations, food stalls last for the first 2 hours, then the stock runs out. That's exactly what happened that night. The terminal cafeterias sold the last sandwiches on their menus within an hour. Imagine this, all the food is gone within an hour. You're stranded at the airport, and you have no idea when you'll be rescued. What kind of scene would we encounter in such a situation? It was inevitable that the stranded passengers would become angry and voices would rise. That's exactly what happened. Airport staff saw tensions rising in the food lines. Police set up barriers and began distributing hot water. People's reactions weren't just about food. There was also a hunger for information. Instead of flight numbers, the screens displayed "Next update in 120 minutes." An estimated 11,400 passengers were stranded inside the terminal. All were provided with sandwiches, water, and disposable blankets. Videos of passengers sleeping on the terminal floor under sleeping bags went viral on social media, receiving millions of views. The focus of the debate was this: if the state cannot even protect the capital's airspace, how can it protect the front lines? For 3 years, propaganda had been saying, "The war is far away." Now, sirens are sounding just 5 kilometers from the Kremlin. People are posting ironic comments like, "Give us Patriots so we can defend ourselves," under videos they filmed with their phones. However, this grim picture was growing even more dire. 14 flights scheduled to depart from Sheremetyevo to Istanbul were rerouted, forcing passengers to endure a 3-leg journey, diverted to Sofia, Varna, and Bucharest instead of Ataturk. The issue wasn't limited to passengers. A DHL cargo plane with a layover in Cologne was forced to return to Dubai, carrying perishable serum supplies. UPS's electronic spare parts landed in Tbilisi from the Moscow-Seoul route, and, while waiting at customs, the timestamp corrupted critical data. Logistics companies issued their first report before 8 a.m. A one-day delay will push regional distribution routes back by 72 hours. Aeroflot stated in its official statement that the cost item is confidential, but aviation economy analysts calculated that the 4-hour delay imposed a minimum of $50 per person for accommodation, $30 for food, and $80 for rebooking. Quick calculations indicate a cash loss of $118 million in a single night. This amount is nearly 1/5 of the airline's total annual profit from 2 years ago. Moreover, this is just the cost of a single night. Worse still, if the increase in insurance premiums becomes permanent, the cost of each additional flight will be burdened with new taxes akin to fluctuating oil prices. Moscow's airspace closure has also disrupted the logistics chains of other major cities within Russia. A cargo plane from Novosibirsk had to divert to Kazan, where it encountered a full parking lot, and was redirected to Omsk, and then to Kemerovo, due to fuel issues. This disruption in the transportation network has damaged the frozen food supply chain. Social media began circulating posts with the hashtag "vegetable prices rose by 10% overnight." Retail markets delayed opening their shelves by 3 hours because fresh produce trucks couldn't renew their documents while circling the airport. Global flight routes also felt the impact of the attack. A flight cancellation means meal, transfer, and accommodation costs for the airline. 354 cancellations qualify as an extraordinary event in the aviation insurance market. London-based reinsurance companies increased their risk factor by 12% that same night. This meant that a company planning to operate a flight from Dubai or Istanbul to Moscow the next day would have to pay tens of thousands of dollars in additional premiums. Some Middle Eastern companies opted to reduce the number of flights or reroute them via Riga or Helsinki. Tour operators transporting tourists to Russia sparked a debate over who would cover the additional insurance costs. Meanwhile, on the global flight route between Asia and Europe, airlines use 3 main corridors: the Northern Polar Route, the Trans-Siberian route within Russia, and the Central Asia Black Sea route. Following the war in Ukraine, the northern route is off-limits for many Western companies, while the Trans-Siberian route is restricted due to sanctions. With Moscow's airspace closed, the only remaining commercial corridor has been burdened with traffic around the Black Sea. Turkish and Greek air traffic control centers issued warnings of excessive congestion. Slot chaos could force companies such as Lufthansa, Emirates, and Singapore Airlines to revise their winter schedules. Behind all this was Ukraine. Kiev's military advisors had been discussing plans for a strategic disruption targeting airports for some time. The goal was not to shoot down planes, but to paralyze the airport economy. Drones were used for this purpose. Each FPV or kamikaze drone costs several $1,000s, while Russia's Pantsir missiles cost $500,000 each. The economic rule is simple. A cheap threat makes an expensive defense chain unsustainable in the long run. The drone attack in Moscow's skies perfectly illustrated this asymmetry. Russia is depleting its own stockpiles by spending money on missiles to shoot down every drone. Moreover, aviation is a country's showcase. If the capital's runway is closed, the message, "We are not a safe zone," is sent to the world. The insurance market immediately translates this message into numbers. Ukraine has achieved precisely this. It has damaged Russia's image, not only militarily but also in the eyes of civilians. Thousands of people sleeping on the terminal floor in Moscow shared their experiences on social media the next day when they returned home. The most shared phrase was, "There was no one to take us home." This is a dangerous crack in the regime's rhetoric, because the state promises its citizens security and logistical services. When citizens feel alone, discussions about political affiliation begin. So far, there have been no large-scale protests in the streets, but polls show a decline in the number of people who say they are satisfied with security. While every cancellation in Russia was converted into foreign currency, the central bank announced a new foreign exchange intervention in the 3rd week of July instead of selling gold. The reason was the risk of a sharp jump in the ruble exchange rate. This was because oil prices were falling, the aviation crisis was cutting tourism revenues, and at the same time, the defense budget was causing devaluation. Treasury experts said, even a flight crisis requires monetary policy. On the 3rd night, state television brought a retired colonel into the studio to calm the public. The colonel said, "We will open the airspace in 5 minutes, there is no problem." However, at the bottom of the screen, the live footage from Sheremetyevo was still showing the list of cancellations. Social media comments quickly debunked the colonel's statement. This contradiction was a heavy blow to propaganda. Even when Moscow reopens the Vnukovo runways, there is still the possibility of new raids. The Defense Ministry has announced a layered microwave concept, with rumors circulating that high-powered laser turrets will be placed around the runway. However, how realistic is this claim given the difficulties in obtaining parts under an electronic embargo? A laser system is not as simple as a radar. It requires power concentration units and cooling equipment, which are also hard to come by under sanctions. 93 inexpensive drones, capable of darkening the capital's skyline, brought down 354 aircraft in a single night, forcing tens of thousands of passengers to spend the night in terminals, triggering an alarm in the international insurance market and shaking Russia's confidence that the conflict won't come to us. What will be the next step? If Russia pours billions of dollars into air defense, it risks losing on the front lines due to a shortage of missiles. If it doesn't, it risks losing due to vulnerabilities in the sky. Which path do you think the Kremlin will choose? Let's discuss in the comments. Don't forget to share the video and subscribe, because we'll be listening to the next siren in the sky together.